Thank you so much, Kathleen, for inviting me to be part of the education series this year. I'll be talking about crisis response and competencies in a troubled world. I have had quite a number of people ask me that why crisis response, why crisis competencies? You are in education, why are you not looking at things around curriculum, things around teaching and learning? And I do reply those people that crisis response and competences is part and parcel of the education sector. My interest in crisis response started many years ago from my background. I will just speak a little bit about my story. Many years ago in Nigeria, my family and I barely escaped with just the clothes on our back from a religious riot. And that happened in the northern part of Nigeria. We came across people who had machetes, who had all kinds of weapons, who were fighting for their belief and fighting for what they think and thought then that it was the right thing to do. And for those of us who are Christians who live in the north, it's a constant battle on our minds. It's a constant reminder that safety is only in the Lord. Safety is not in any other place, but safety is found in our Lord. And so my kids and I were barely able to escape from these people who were coming at us. We were able to run into an army barracks, and that was our saving grace. We left that city a few days later. In that context, there was no leadership, there was no crisis response. Lives were lost. So many lives were lost. I recall my children we just drove driving past and seeing human bodies on the highway. That's created so much trauma and mental health stress for myself and my kids. The second reason why I'm looking at crisis response and competencies in the troubled world was when we relocated from that city to a different city, still in the northern part of Nigeria. I'm sure most of you must have heard about Boko Haram. Well, you heard about it. I lived the experience. I lived in that fear myself, my kids, the school where I was. We had to come up with different policies and different strategies and different crisis management responses in how to keep us safe, how to avoid having our students and even we as administrators and teachers from being kidnapped, and how to, in case a bomb was happened, what will we do to protect lives, to protect property? And so living through that crisis, being a part of the crisis management team, coming up with different policies was so important for our safety. When I moved to U of C for my PhD, I learned about some crises that had happened to the institution because the crisis didn't happen on the campus, but it happened to the institutions because members of the university community were involved. I decided, after discussing with my supervisor, my research supervisor, I decided that I want to look at crisis response. How do institutions, post-secondary institutions, handle crisis? And what types of responses do they have? And what types of competencies are needed to respond to crisis? So that has been my journey and what led me to crisis response in a troubled world. Now, for today's the focus for today's outcomes, I will be looking at we'll read a little bit of scripture and then explore some information on crisis, look at crisis response, look at crisis leadership and crisis leadership competences. If you see me look up, it's because I have using two screens. So I have my notes on a screen just ahead of me, and I have my slides on the screen here that I'm staring at. Now, when I look at crisis in this context, I'll be looking at crisis that involves post-secondary schools. But this context, the slides, this research can also be applied to other types of schools. Unfortunately, crisis has become a prominent condition that is affecting not just institutions of learning in post-secondary, but K to 12 as well, especially in these times of COVID-19 crisis. I'm going to be reading from 1 Samuel 30, verse 6, and I'll be reading from the Amplified Bible. Just a little bit, a bit of background to this story. David um, had run away from King Saul, and he had a few men. He had men that were with him, and he lived in the camp. Now, David was going back to his home, and when they got back to his home, himself and his men, his general, they discovered that their camp had been raided. Their wives, their sons, their daughters, their property had been taken away and been taken captive. And the Bible says here that David was greatly distressed, for the men spoke of stoning him, because the souls of them all were bitterly grieved, each man for his sons and his daughters. But David encouraged and strengthened himself in the Lord. This scripture really speaks to me. Why? Because in this situation, David was in a crisis situation. They had just, he has just lost his family. His men have lost their family, and they were so grieved and bitter that they all thought about stoning him. Now, in this situation, David could have just given up and says, the crisis has happened, do whatever you want to do. But the Bible says here that David encouraged himself in the Lord and strengthened himself. He realized that at this point of crisis, in this moment, there was a greater being than him, and he looked to the Lord for the wisdom, for the encouragement, for the strength, and the next steps in responding to the crisis. And that brings me to the fact that in crisis situations, we need a team. We need people that we can work with that can give us direction during a crisis. Now I'm going to define what a crisis is. A crisis is organizational an organizational crisis, sorry, is a specific, unexpected, and non-routine events or series of events that create high levels of uncertainty. At the same time, presents an organization with both opportunities for threats and changes. Now, one thing to understand is that crisis has no borders, it has no boundaries. It can exceed the university compound, it can happen in the community and spill over into the university compound. Now, unfortunately, in the last few years, we have had an increase of crisis situations in our schools. It's become a reality that we all have to grapple with. The old saying that this cannot happen to us is actually changing right now to when will this happen to us? When will we encounter this situation? I have some examples of crisis situations happening in post-secondary context right now. We all know about COVID-19. This that is it's not just happening to in here in Alberta. It's happening all over the world. It's a global pandemic. It's a global crisis. There's and it, right now in Alberta, the numbers are increasing at a very fast rate. We've heard of a teacher that was killed in France. And I mean, teachers are no longer safe as it is. We've heard of racism and riots that are happening in the US that have spilled over to different parts of the world. We've seen tornadoes. We've seen there's been an increase in frequency and severity of extreme weather events with tornadoes, with floods happening in Calgary a few years ago, with forest fires in Fort McMurray a few years ago. Additionally, we've seen so many human-directed attacks, school shootings that have taken place, not just in the US, but it's spilled over to different regions of the world. A spillover of all this is mental health. There's been an increase of mental health problems and challenges in the last few years that we've not experienced before. And so crisis leaves an aftermath of a significant lasting impact on our minds, on our hearts, on our lives. And it increases, the rates of mental health illness and challenges that we have. Crisis may sometimes, in the post-secondary institutions, the crisis may not actually happen on campus, but we see the effect that it has on our campuses. Now, let's look at some characteristics of a crisis. Unfortunately, every crisis has certain types of characteristics. They all share certain characteristics. It grows in magnitude. You start small, and before you know it, it's become a huge pandemic. It grows in frequency. It grows in complexity. The complexity of handling a crisis it's so varied. There's always chaos with the potential to permanently tear at the fabric of an institution if a crisis is not well handled. There's time constraints. In a crisis situation, the information is coming at you so fast, and you're also not getting the whole picture. You're not getting all information that you need at the same time. So there is time constraint. You are trying to save lives with within a limited time that you have. There's always that mental health stress, the multiplier effect. The people, everyone goes through that mental health stress when you're handling a crisis. Could be a crisis of a student murder, it could be a crisis of a flood. There's that multiplier effect of mental health stress. Of course, it's always remarkably unusual in its circumstances. It's not the everyday type of crisis that we experience. I've said it earlier that there's limited information and sometimes conflicting information coming at us from different parts. The traditional media coming at us trying to get information from us. There's the social media pressure because rumors are rife everywhere. People are saying different things happening at the same time. So there's that conflicting information being passed across. And there's always a need for immediate and decisive action. Why? Because of the impact it has on lives, the impact it has on people, the impact it has on property, the impact it has on the community. And so we always, leaders and would-be leaders, need to take decisive and immediate action. It's not the time for long deliberations that you would have in a day-to-day routine type of a challenge. And crisis usually is something that is not part of your everyday, the printer broke down or your PowerPoint is not working. No, crisis is something that happens in a high magnitude. Now, it now becomes so important, leadership becomes so important during a crisis because crisis situations can be quite disorienting and are causing high degrees of uncertainties for leaders, for everyone that is involved. Now, it is in this darkness and chaos that leadership becomes the most critical, the most visible, and the most desired of university leaders. Leaders during a crisis need to be visible, they need to be seen, they need to be out there wrestling with all that is required in the areas of crisis prevention, crisis detection, management, and communication. It's so important that leaders are at the forefront of handling a crisis in a post-secondary institution so that it doesn't spill over into, it doesn't spill over. Leaders have to be there, making sure that lives are being preserved. Now, let's look at why leadership is important during a crisis. Whether an organization survives the crisis with its reputation intact is usually determined less by the severity of the crisis, but more by how the leadership handles the crisis, the timeliness of how the crisis has been handled, and the effectiveness of response. And so if a crisis happens, leaders need to get the crisis management team into action immediately and be timely to respond to this crisis. Now, it's and in handling a crisis, really, it is no small feat, not at all. Now, in crisis situations at the same time often influence the operations or finances of an institution, in addition to threatening the reputation of the institution. So, if there is a failure to respond to crisis, govern it effectively, or manage the crisis, the results can be a loss of legitimacy of the school, can result to system breakdown, can result to chaos with far-reaching consequences and uncontrollable outcomes. So, schools need to be out and in front, forward thinking, ready to handle crisis, have crisis management plans, prepared ahead of time, have contingency plans organized, have business continuity plans organized in case, not if, but when the crisis happens. Now let's see some impact of crisis on an institution. Now, one of the impacts of a crisis is reputational risk, and it is a top risk for colleges and for universities due to its increasing likelihood, its quickness to spread, and the high impact that such a risk can have on an institution. Now, reputation is an evaluation that a stakeholder makes about an organization or about an institution, and it's usually a major driver of value for a university or a school. And unfortunately, anything that paints an institution's reputation in a bad light is a ding in that asset. It's an evaluative thing that is the currency of an institution. And therefore, it becomes so important that managing reputational risk. Effective management of reputational risk will lead to a high performing institution. So it's so important that leaders are out and in front of handling crisis situations. I will stop here for 5 minutes. I have just a 5 minute activity for you all. And the question here is, what are some consequences if an institution fails to respond to crisis? Please type your answers into the chat box. Yes, I see the answers coming in. Failure to respond. Thank you for those conversations. Now let's really see. Your answers are correct. The impacts of failure to respond to crisis leads to decreased provincial funding. It leads to decreased contributions from donors. It equally leads to significant drop in the numbers and types of new student applications. You begin to have accreditation problems, key employee turnover because crisis was not happened well, was not responded to well, and the negative perception of the institution by major stakeholders. I'll give you a few examples. A few years ago, a university had to pay a ransom due to a ransomware that infected its operations. And that led to some problems that happened as a result of the ransomware being paid. You also had 2 years ago, there was a high profile racial protest at University of Missouri, and enrollments due to that high racial protest, the effect on it was that they had significant drops in enrollment, more than 37% of drops, and budget cuts had to come into place, thereby leading to a temporal closure of 7 resident halls and elimination of 400 staff positions. That was as a result of crisis not being handled properly. So it becomes so important then that leadership, studying leadership, and its accompanying competencies become paramount in the light of the impacts of crisis on lives and operations. And so let's see, what then is crisis leadership and what are its accompanying competencies? Given the pressures that and the demands that a leader faces in a crisis, And crisis can be unique and it requires a different set of competencies from the usual day-to-day types of competencies that you need. Let me give you an example. In the usual day-to-day running of a school, some decisions can take longer. It can take months, weeks for decisions to be arrived at, because you're consulting with different sectors of the school, you're consulting with different faculties and different departments. In a crisis situation, we do not have that luxury of consulting for a long period of time. Decisions need to be taken as quick as possible because lives are involved. And in these situations, you need a different set of competencies that can function in a crisis situation. And unfortunately, good leadership does not automatically operate in a crisis. That has been proven by literature. And so, what then is crisis leadership? Crisis leadership happens to be a series of dynamic behaviors from prevention of crisis to response to post events through management levels to protect the organization. And when I talk about management levels here, it doesn't necessarily always have to be those at the top. It could be a teacher in the classroom trying to manage a crisis situation in a classroom. Now, in operating this dynamic behaviors from prevention to response to post events, a certain type of frame of mind is required, and that's the crisis leadership frame of mind. And this frame of mind is accompanied by a key set of behaviors. And these behaviors includes being open to new experiences, being willing to learn and to take risk, an assumption that all things are possible during a crisis, that you can save as many lives as possible. And a belief that even in crisis, in times of crisis, people and organizations can emerge better off after the crisis than before. The crisis leadership frame of mind is so important because in a crisis, you need quick judgments. Yeah, well, you have to be quick. Judgments have to be quick. Quick judgment must be made. Standards need to be refined. Options, plans, strategies need to be established. And the crisis leader actually becomes the leader, whether you're in the classroom, whether you're in a post-secondary context, becomes the rallying point for crisis management and control. And this leader is responsible for responding to whatever threats that the organization is facing, is responsible for responding to uncertainties, responsible for responding to the worry that comes during a crisis, because people are cautious, people are afraid, people are gullible, people are waiting for leaders to handle and the complexities that arise from a crisis. And so people are actually depending on their leaders for direction, for decisions, for what to do during a crisis. So, crisis leadership is actually based on several inherent assumptions that in a crisis, with appropriate responses, they can be managed in a way to lessen its real or potential negative impact. And so, these inherent assumptions are that a crisis is acute, it's dangerous. Someone shooting off in a campus situation, that's dangerous. That a crisis can be managed in such a way that it lessens the real or potential negative impact on people. That without some strategic responses, the nature of a crisis can expand quickly and dangerously. And we have seen that happen with some countries and the way they've handled COVID-19 responses. That crisis responders, so leaders in the classroom, leaders in post-secondary institution, individual and collectively hold the key. And this is so important because leaders hold the key to whether a crisis can be contained successfully or the crisis cannot be contained successfully. There are many cases and many examples of unsuccessful handling of crisis that have led to loss of human lives. And we see that still playing out with COVID-19 situations happening right now. Now, crisis response. I just want to talk a little bit about crisis response. I'm just going to pitch my tent here for a few minutes. Crisis response is usually based on the crisis response plan. And all phases of the crisis response plan should be highly interconnected, with every phase influencing the other phases. So I have adapted this from literature. And here we can see that the crisis response plan is multifaceted. It's a multifaceted process that is aimed at minimizing the social and physical impact of a crisis. And it starts from prevention and mitigation to being prepared, to responding to the crisis, to recovery, and to revision. At the prevention and mitigation stage, this is the action that colleges and institutions take to decrease the likelihood of a crisis occurring by being able to detect the early warning signals. Now, at the preparedness stage, this phase stage is where the CMT, that's the crisis management teams, or the teachers, or those involved in responding to crisis, come up with the processes, come up with different protocols to prepare the institution for potential emergency. The response phase is the phase where there's immediate protection of life and property, and you're trying to re-establish some control and minimize the effect of the disaster. And at this phase is where you are collaborating with other institutions, you are collaborating with different faculties on campus, you are collaborating with the Alberta, if the crisis happens here in Edmonton, you are collaborating with the Edmonton Emergency Service. So lots of collaborations happen during the response phase of crisis. Now, the recovery phase is the phase where there's an ongoing process, and the goal of this phase is to restore learning in the learning environment, is to try to restore things to some semblance of normalcy and begin to give people that a bit of normalcy. And the final stage, which is the revision stage, is the stage where you go back to review how the crisis was handled. Were there certain things that were lacking during the crisis response? Were there certain places that they were weak? Are there certain areas you need to strengthen in your plan? So the revision stage is a stage where you review how crisis response went, and you strengthen those areas that need to be strengthened. Now, in responding to the crisis and looking at the crisis response plan, you then think of what then are the competencies that are needed? What are the competencies that leaders need? And when I talk about competencies, I'm talking about the skills that are required. How can these leaders respond effectively to the different stages of crisis response? And so leaders should ask the question, what do I need to know? What are the competencies that are necessary and required for my job performance as a crisis leader? Now, when I talk about competencies, I'm talking about the knowledge, the skills, the abilities that are required to successfully complete crisis response, and an understanding of the context for executing the crisis management strategy. So leaders should be ready to ask, what do I need to know? What are the competencies that are required? What are the skills that I need to be bringing to the table? I have this higher education crisis competency model. Now, this model was developed out of my research. This framework came out of my research. And in the troubled world that we live in, especially now in the times that we are in, developing these competencies was so important because it's there were responses that came from leaders who handled different types of crisis. By no means, this list, these competencies are not exhaustive, but they reflect the prominent characteristics that emerged from my conversation with the different leaders that I had interviewed. I propose this model because I believe that this model will help us to see ways in which leadership and the competences are manifested. I started with the first one, and each competency is interrelated. They work together. That's why you have it in this nested form. They're actually nested in one another. And I start off with the individual personal competencies that an individual ought to have, an individual crisis leader ought to have. So this is me as an individual. What are these competencies that I need to have in a crisis to handle a crisis? And so we have things, these are personal competencies, and these personal competencies are an array of personal characteristics that are associated with the practice of crisis leadership, including that a leader approaches the crisis in a calm manner. In fact, the calm manner was a thread that kept running throughout all leaders' responses. That a crisis leader needs to be calm. If a crisis leader is not calm and you're showing being in a panic state, then it affects the people that you are leading. Crisis leader needs to be humble, needs to show self-control, needs to listen carefully, especially in a situation where you're trying to save lives and you're trying to provide for victims who have been in a flood or victims who have had any crisis happen to them. They need to be thoughtful, and they also need to demonstrate self-care and mental health care towards themselves as well as their the people they are leading. Now, the next set of competencies happen to be individual leadership competencies. In this case, the leadership competencies look at the ability to analyze the crisis situation, the environment, and triage a crisis. And in doing that, the crisis leader looks for needs competencies around being flexible, being decisive, being an effective communicator, because you need to collaborate and communicate not just with the people you're leading, but external audiences as well. You have to be open to new possibilities and ideas, because in a crisis situation, you have to think outside the box to save lives. You have to be a good relationship builder, and building those necessary relationships you will need. Finally, needs to be able to provide information as quickly and as accurately as possible. The final thing in the competency model happens to be the response of the crisis team itself. Now, this is the right response, the crisis team, the organizational competencies that should be coming to the table. And in this case, it's an understanding of the positional and specific role, responsibilities, policies, behaviors, and the norms that an organization has. And so, as an organization, the crisis team or crisis management team or the crisis leader should be having sound technical knowledge of how to handle crisis. You should be able to put together a competent team in a very short period of time, as quickly as possible if needed. Also, I found that past experience in crisis response, not putting in a novice, but putting in someone who has had experiences in handling a crisis. Because if putting in a novice in a crisis situation, the novice may not know what to do. And you're looking at, and human lives are at stake. And finally, crisis leaders should be ready to practice, ready to train, and have deep institutional knowledge of the processes in an institution. Understand what the continuity plans are, understand what the institution stands for, and how the institution intends to respond to crisis. Now, what are some implications for this competency model? Now, because this model was generated from educational crisis leaders' perspective, the model happens to be authentic. It's an indicator of how valuable these competencies are in a higher education setting. And these competencies can be also used in a K to 12 setting as well. Now, this competency model is people focused on building trust to move an institution forward through crisis situations. In addition, it provides an understanding of the different types of competencies that are required in training situations. So there are, the model also serves as a framework for training, where you have simulations or you have tabletop activities and you have group activities. The model can be used in a training session to help leaders improve and also develop the competencies that are required. There are also one thing I want you to note is that a combination of several competencies may be applied. So that's why I said they are nested. It's not one or the other. You can have a combination of several crisis competencies being applied in a situation. The competencies can also be enhanced through consistent use and consistent practice. It's not inherent. Some people have to learn to be good listeners. So it can be through enhanced through consistent practice and consistent use. And finally, the ability to display all competencies can be influenced by the individual personal background, the individual's belief, and the experience in crisis management. Now, I want us to also know that one thing to be aware here is, as a leader who is going into handling a crisis situation, you need to be aware of your own experiences when you're handling a crisis. What are some past traumas you might have in relation to the crisis you might be handling? What are some ways you can, support, provide, get that support so that you're able to respond to that crisis without having the past traumas come into play? What are ways that if you can't handle the crisis, it's good to just be aware and probably getting someone else who can handle that situation based on the past experiences you've had in crisis situations. And a final activity that we would have, and to end this with this activity, I would like that you reflect on an experience in managing a crisis, personal or otherwise, and think about which of the competencies contributed to your success. Which competency would you want to improve on? As as I end this presentation, I do ask that as leaders who are handling crisis, it's so important that you get support for your mental health and your self-care when you respond to crisis, because that is one factor that came to play during my research. Not Leaders found that they were providing support to others, to those who had the need, and we're not providing support, getting support for themselves. So please, it's important to get some sort of support for yourself, because crisis situations can be traumatic. They can lead to post-traumatic stress, and they can lead to you just having a complete mental breakdown and shutdown. That's why I said, as a leader, be aware of your crisis experiences as you go into handling crisis. So, and that's what I have for today. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to share part of my research, and thank you for listening.